Hi, I'm Sherry from Whole Circle Studio, and welcome to the Greenhouse Garden Block of the Month in Quilt Sew Along. I'm so happy that you're joining us on this fun foundation paper piecing journey. Today, I'm going to give you some tips as you begin to make your first greenhouse garden block. But before we get to that, just a few reminders and other tips. If you're new to foundation paper piecing, or if you're a bit rusty, be sure to refer to the general foundation paper piecing tips included in the pattern, along with my free mini class on general foundation paper piecing. The link is below. I highly recommend checking this out, especially if you're new to paper piecing, or if you have some challenges with this technique. It has lots of extra paper piecing prep and sewing tips, including how to tackle those tricky angles when piecing. Also, what we review today is applicable to all of the blocks, so you may want to come back to this video while you're working on your future blocks. So have you decided yet what quilt size you're going to make with your greenhouse garden blocks? You don't necessarily have to know at this point, but let me give you some details that might help you with your decision. If you would like less seams to align, the quilt layouts with the mullions and the sashing are a great choice, like the quilt I have back here, since you don't need to align seams when you're joining these blocks 1 through 12. I use the mullion sashing in one version of the throw, that's option B2, the twin size quilt, and the queen size quilt that you see behind me here. As a reminder, if you're planning on making the twin size quilt or the queen size quilt with the greenhouse roof section and cacti borders, you'll need to pick up the add-on block pack sold separately. If you'd like to make a smaller quilt, the runner and wall hangings are a great option. And with all 12 blocks, you'll get 4 runners, each containing 3 blocks that you can display all at the same time or swap them out when you wish. Another great alternative is just keeping the blocks separate as a mini quilt or even framing them. I like to think of these individual greenhouse garden blocks as little works of art in themselves. I can't wait to see what you make with your blocks. Let's get into the nitty-gritty and some helpful reminders. When you're printing your pattern pages, make sure that your print setting is exactly at 100% or actual size. I can't stress this enough. Technology does really funky things and will often want to print a percentage or two smaller. If this happens, you may not realize it until you're ready to sew your pieces together, and they may not all fit in a line. This is heartbreaking. So it's really important to measure the 1-inch block on every page to confirm that it really does measure exactly 1 inch. Sometimes printers and copiers will print actual size on page 1 and then decide to change its mind on page 2. So again, make sure before piecing you measure every single page. I get asked a lot if this pattern is compatible with freezer foundation paper piecing. If you're not sure what that is, I have a link below to a video mini class. Because I only need to make one type of block for each of this quilt, I didn't use freezer paper to piece greenhouse garden. I used regular paper or newsprint. We'll talk about this in a minute. For this quilt, I find that it's just easier to rip out the paper at the end versus spending a lot of time that it takes to manually trace on freezer paper. Also, most of the greenhouse garden blocks have large sections, so it's quicker to take out the paper for me than to prep freezer paper. That said, if you prefer to use the freezer paper, you certainly can. I have my pattern pages printed to this letter size newsprint that I purchased inexpensively by the ream online. If you're curious, I put a link below to where you can get this paper too. I like this newsprint that's pre-cut because, again, it's pretty inexpensive. It runs through my printer, my laser printer, really well, and it's pretty easy to rip out at the end. That said, I used plain copy paper for many years before I found this, and that's a perfectly fine paper as well to use. It just may be a little bit more challenging to rip out at the end. You'll want to go ahead and trim your paper pieces out on the outer thinner line. I have a rotary cutter that is dedicated for paper use only, and then I use the edge of my ruler to trim. I sometimes find that it's a little bit easier to actually not align it on the outside edge, but to align it on that second line that's 1/4 of an inch. Again, this is our seam allowance between this outer line and this next line. So I actually find that it's easier to visually align 1/4 inch in from the ruler on that inner line and then trim. If it's easier for you to trim some other way or to look at the edge of the ruler, that's perfectly fine, as long as you get this excess trimmed off. Of course, if you're more comfortable using paper scissors to do this trimming, that's totally fine too. We're going to ignore the dashed lines that you see in this pattern on piece E, the left and the right. Ignore the dashed lines for now. We'll talk about that in a moment. One other thing I wanted to mention about all of the paper pieces is you'll notice in the seam allowance what block it's for. That way, if you get things mixed up for any reason, it's very, very clear what they go to. It's really important to me for my quilt patterns to be accessible and easy for everyone to print. For that reason, all of my quilt patterns are set up on a standard US letter size paper measuring 8.5 by 11. Because of this, a little bit of assembly of paper piece templates are sometimes required for larger paper pieces. This process is similar to what you would do when assembling a pattern for clothing. Let me show you how I like to cut and tape these pieces. I first cut the pieces on the solid outer thinner lines, and then I use the diagrams shown in the preparation section of the pattern to know how to arrange the pieces. If a dashed line appears on the left or on the top side of the piece, I like to leave 1/2 inch of paper to the left or the top of the dashed line so the papers will eventually overlap when joined. For dashed lines that appear on the right or on the bottom, I cut right on the dashed line. So for this piece, I see a dashed line here on the right-hand side. So I'm going to trim right on the dashed line. For this piece, the dashed line's on the left-hand side. So I'm going to position my ruler on the dashed line at 1/2 inch, leaving an extra 1/2 inch of paper beyond the dashed line. I then like to assemble the pieces in horizontal rows, carefully aligning the X's, the lines, and the cut edges on the printed side of the paper. That way I'll never have tape touching the fabric, which will be on this side. This is really important in case your iron is a little bit too hot and melts the tape. You don't want that tape melting onto your fabric. So here I'm going to go ahead and align the X's, the edges, and go ahead and tape on this side. I find that having the overlap of paper on the edge makes my template less floppy, more rigid, and more accurate. If there are more than 2 pieces next to each other, like this paper piece here that's in a different block, here I assembled C1 to C2. I left 1/2 inch of overlap. Same thing with C3 and C4. So once the horizontal rows are together, I then tape those rows together, again, carefully matching the X's and the lines. So much like you would make a quilt when we're piecing together our blocks, we'll first tape together our pieces into rows and then tape those rows together to complete the paper piece. Once the paper pieces are joined, You're going to ignore this dashed line. You're going to then fill this entire numbered section with one piece of fabric. Staying organized often makes quilt making a lot easier. In each block, I included a key for you to tape or glue your fabric swatches. This makes it easy to stay organized whether you're using the chart to pre-cut your fabric pieces or not. This also corresponds to the key that you'll find in the welcome packet. You'll notice that the chart shading corresponds to the shading on the paper pieces as well. If you're cutting and labeling your fabric according to the cutting diagrams, it's pretty easy to keep the fabrics organized and assigned. The sizes listed in the cutting chart are approximately 3/4 of an inch bigger than the sections that they need to cover on the paper pieces. If you're new to paper piecing, you may find that you may need to cut your fabric pieces a little bit bigger. If you're a more experienced paper piecer, you might find more efficient ways to cut your fabric. Depending on your printer, it may be challenging to see the shading difference between the sections on your paper pieces. So you may want to make a note on the paper pieces before you start sewing, especially if you're not pre-cutting and labeling your fabric. If you're having a challenging time seeing the difference, you can refer to the letters and numbers in the fabric cutting chart. One of the benefits of pre-cutting your fabric using the cutting chart is that if you label as you cut, it takes the guesswork out of shading and what piece of fabric goes in one section. You could just grab and sew. Remember, once your paper pieces are assembled, you're going to ignore the dashed line and cover an entire numbered section with one piece of fabric. As I'm paper piecing, I sometimes find it helpful to use a water-soluble glue stick to attach the fabric to the first section of my paper piece, especially for these larger sections here. I'll put the link below to my favorite glue sticks. They're a bit pricier than regular glue sticks or ones made for kids, but they make removing the paper less frustrating later on. I find more mainstream glue sticks leaves paper on your fabric, which could be a pain. After all of your paper pieces A through E for this block are complete, you can go ahead and trim the fabric at the outer edge of the paper. You may find that you can use leftover fabric scraps to paper piece future blocks. I like to hang on to these fabric scraps, typically anything larger than 1.5 inch square, as it allows me to be more efficient with my overall fabric usage. There are no critical alignments in this block when you're joining your paper pieces together. However, you will notice that there are some dots on the paper pieces. Here's one on paper piece A here in the corner. We have some others here on paper piece B. You can ignore these dots for now. If you are not adding mullions or sashing between your blocks later, you'll use these symbols to align the seams when joining block 1 with other blocks. In a future video, I'll be giving my tips and tricks for achieving precise alignments, but for right now, this isn't necessary. If you're making a quilt without the mullions and sashing, I prefer to keep all the paper on my blocks until I'm ready to sew my blocks together later on. Again, we'll be using some of these dots here on the paper pieces to get really crisp alignments between the blocks. I find that I'm more accurate with my alignments if I use these symbols with my paper on when joining these blocks later on. You'll also find my recommendations for when to remove paper in each month's pattern. I can't wait to see your blocks come together. Thanks again for being here and for sewing along with us. I'll be back next month with more tips. In the meantime, be sure to share your progress online using the Greenhouse Garden hashtags found on the pattern and tag me so we can all check out what you're working on. Or I'd love for you to email me photos of your blocks when you're ready to share. My email address can be found in the pattern. See you next month and happy sewing!